Okay, Professor Depaepe, we recently celebrated your convocation ceremony at KU Leuven. You can look back on a research career of more than 40 years. So I wonder whether and how you have seen the history of education change as an academic discipline. Do you think that researchers in our field, and perhaps also yourself, practice the history of education differently now than they did in the past?
That's a good question, of course, but I think I can be positive about it, but it's not so simple to answer it because you have got, indeed, in the history of education, as far as research is concerned, some paradigm shifts, but paradigm shifts are not the same in the social sciences, I think, as in the natural sciences. It's not like Kuhn has described in his book, The History of the Scientific Revolutions. Generally speaking, I think one can say that from the beginning when I started, like journals like Pedagogica, Historica and so were still very much concentrated around the history of ideas and of educational thought and things like that. And of course in the 1960s in the United States, the 1970s in Europe, one tried to combine more and more history of education with so-called real history and first and foremost with social history, and afterwards in the 1990s I think came this shift towards cultural history. But that does not mean that everything is that there is one position now within that paradigm of cultural history of education. You have a lot of different positions and discussions theoretically, methodologically as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And looking back on your career, what are you most proud of? In other words, what would you consider to be your biggest achievement?
My biggest achievement, first of all, to be proud of course, science is something which gives you intrinsic feeling of that you are doing well, something that you are interested in. And I think you don't do it for the honor, but from time to time it is, of course, very, you are very happy that the people feel you are important or whatever. So the biggest achievements, I was very happy with my doctorates. I've made 2 PhDs because at that time this was still necessary to climb up in the social ladder of the research institute I was involved in. But also on the other hand, the organization of, and within ISHE, I've been secretary, I have been president of ISHE, and also the organization here at Kortrijk in 1998 of the 20th conference of ISHE was very important for me. And afterwards, of course, also the honorary degree in Riga. I think this was important not only for me, but also for the field. And 2 days ago, this convocation ceremony you are referring to was also important, I think, not only for me, but for the field. And particularly for people like you, my successors, I think that that it is important if you can show for a big public how important history of education is. But the thing that gives me most intrinsic value is not that much a lot of publications. Of course, this is important. Good books, to write good books is important. But most important is probably to invest in people. And I was very proud that I have 24 PhDs that I could guide as a supervisor or co-supervisor, and that from these people, they are working now in higher education or in education in 14 countries. Among them 6 countries from Africa, 2 in Asia, and so on, all over the world. And I think this is really also developmental work. It's important, I think, from the intellectual part of society that they invest also in that kind of developmental aid.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of young researchers, we live in a time when the university is changing and more researchers are confronted with a culture of publish or perish. And what is your take on this? And do you have any suggestions for young researchers, young scholars, as to how to cope with that kind of...
Well, I think I could say some things about that. One thing is certainly you should publish anyhow, because otherwise you won't be taken seriously. And I think this is also the natural end of doing research. You have to communicate with an audience somewhere, and publication is still one of the possibilities, although publications became more and more specialized in the sense that they are published in very highly specialized journals, which are only read by few people. And this is, for me, a paradox, because you are paid by the national government or by the federal or whatever, in Belgium by the Flemish government, and you should publish for 10, 20 people around the world, but not for the Flemish people that pay you. So I think it's very important not only to do what the scientific career obliges you to do, but to try to have publications also in Flemish, because this is democracy. Intellectuals here in our country have right to read this is one thing I could say. A second thing is, as you know, I have been vice rector as well, and I tried with the rector, the then rector, to change a little bit the climate, but that's very hard, because internationally this climate of quantitative evaluations and publish and perish is still translated into output and that they can count. But I think it's much more important to have output that is qualitatively important, and that you can defend yourself by saying why it is important for you and why it is important for the country or whatever. And I think this will change. This has to change, because saying publications is the only thing and counting publications, not reading them. We even have had a rector that said publications are not there to be read, but to be counted. That is, of course, nonsense. You write something which you think is sensible. So I think you have to communicate, and I was always in favor of doing research in teamwork. Because I think also for the history that is important. Just to say one thing, to make an equilibrium of ideological and differences, for instance, to avoid partisan reading of history, it's important. Like, take for instance the colonial matter. I think we have to, and the racial issues that have been involved in colonial teams, you have to work with Congolese, in our case, Belgian Congo. I think this is important on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it is also important to look for alternative things in publications, and I think in the future, exhibitions, for instance, would be also have to be considered as a scientific output, because for a good exhibition or for a good museum, you have to have a scientific approach as well.
Absolutely. To conclude this interview, I'd like to ask you one last question. We started this interview by looking back onto any potential changes that occurred within the discipline, but what about the future? How do you look at the future of the history of education as an academic discipline?
Well, as far as history of education research is concerned, I'm not that negative, because I think people are historical beings, and they are also, the difference probably with animals is that we educate our children. So education and history are two anthropological things that are related to the to being a human. So I think the natural interests for history on the one hand and for education and for the combination of both will remain. But I am a little bit more pessimistic about the field as, let's say, organized subdiscipline or whatever in curricula and in university circles or in higher education. In the teacher training in the 19th century, it was the most essential subject. Not that we have continued these ideas, because of course history was used, and I spoke about it, as you will know, 2-3 days ago in this convocation ceremony. I am against too much uses and abuses of the past, of the educational past, but that was one case. They used it to enhance let's say, the position of the teacher and his role and his task, and so on and so on. But history of education was a kind of, as we called it, history of pedagogy, and it was in the framework of education very important. But it moved, this paradigm shifts I spoke about, it moved toward, it was historicized, let's say, so it moved in the direction of history, which was, I think, for the research a very good thing. But that means that the question of relevance is, again, at stake, and that a lot of education people want to re-educationalize or just to drop the history of education because they do not consider it as relevant anymore. My position was that you have to stress the, let's say, the sublime irrelevance of the relevant, or the relevant of the irrelevant. I wrote once an article on qualities of irrelevance, and I think this is really also part of Bildung, as the Germans call it, not in the sense that you use history, but to find your own place, to relativize, to see how debates, how paradoxes has evolved, and so on. It's on another level, it's on a more abstract level, but I think it's really very important also for educators. And I think we have to demonstrate by really good research how important it is for the development of thinking. But I'm not quite sure that in our technocratic and neoliberal society, in which everything has to be very useful, history of education will remain in the curriculum of educational institutes. And that's a little bit, that concerns me a little bit, yeah. But let's be hopeful, and I think if we can produce good research, then people will that reflect. Because history is the only discipline in which you can show to the people how this conquest for usefulness took roots in history. It's a kind of modernism, of enlightenment, and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. This strand for utility, and so I hope for intellectuals that it will remain very important to do history of education. And I wish you and the coming generation all the best for that.
That's an excellent way to conclude this interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you.